Hello yet again. We're going to have a series of videos here for Unit 3 from Chapter 19, which are going to review the major blood vessels of the body that you need to know for the anatomy part of Unit 3. Well, I can see my PowerPoint here is going to cause me some issues. Hang on. All right, there we go. Okay, here's the good news. I don't really have any bad news for you about blood vessels, but the good news is, as you guys know, there are lots of arteries and veins in the body, and in a more extensive anatomy course like you would have if you are going to medical school or if you're going to dental optometry school where you have to dissect a cadaver, you would have to learn a whole lot more arteries and veins, the identities of them. So keep that in mind. If those types of things are in your future graduate level education in the health sciences, you're going to have to learn a whole lot more arteries and veins in the future. What we do for our class is we expect you to learn the major arteries and veins of the body. We don't expect you to learn a lot of the little side street arteries that come off of the main ones. Okay, now that might sound really easy. The harder part on the blood vessel anatomy side is learning how all these blood vessels interconnect, because what we ask you to do in our Calhoun anatomy courses is learn how to trace a pretend drop of blood from the right atrium. Here's our pulmonary and systemic circuit diagram that we've taken a look at before. If you imagine a drop of blood that's here in the right atrium, and let's say we want to send it down to the lower part of the leg and then back to the right atrium, what we expect you to do is learn the major arteries and veins through which that blood vessel would pass to go to that area and come back to the heart. And a key thing to learn is that blood flow is a one-way street. I'll preach that over and over again. It is a one-way street. And so a blood drop that is starting here in the right atrium, guess what? It goes down to the right ventricle, then it gets pumped through the pulmonary circuit, comes into the lungs, gets oxygenated in a capillary bed surrounding one of those little tiny air sacs in the lungs. Now it's oxygenated, it goes back to the left atrium, down into the left ventricle, and then finally it gets pumped into the aorta, where it starts its journey to whatever body location we ask you to trace it to. It goes to that location, it goes through a capillary bed eventually in that area where it's going to deliver its oxygen gas and nutrients and so forth to that particular body location. And then it's going to start its journey back to the heart, so it's going to return through the system of veins that eventually leads you right back where you started over here at the right atrium. So just keep that in mind right away. If a blood drop is starting here in the right atrium, it is going to have to go through the whole pulmonary circuit back to the heart, and then it enters the systemic circuit, goes to whatever body location it is, where it's going to drop off its oxygen gas and pick up the CO2, and then it has to come back through the system of veins back to the heart. So it's always this one-way street, this one-way direction of flow. So blood drops do not take little detours, they don't take side streets and things like that. They don't have that capability. And if you have been working on the physiology side of Chapter 19, we've been talking about over there how it's the blood pressure changes across the cardiovascular system that force that one-way flow to happen. So your highest pressures are here in the aorta and its early branches, and then those pressures gradually drop. They get lower, 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 and lower as you approach the capillary beds. Pressure gets lower across the capillary beds as you enter the venules, the smallest veins, and then the veins. Pressure keeps dropping, etc., until you get back over here to the right atrium. So that keeps the blood flowing. Those pressure drops keep it flowing in one direction. Okay, so you guys have seen the pulmonary and the systemic circuit before. And again, keep in mind, blood is always flowing from a system of arteries to arterioles. Those are the little smaller microscopic type arteries that lead then to capillaries. Capillaries, these tiniest of blood vessels that are microscopic, their walls are only 1 cell thick. That's where you have the exchanges of fluids and gases and nutrients and waste and so forth back and forth with the tissue fluids. Here we are with a capillary bed in a pretend tissue. The blood becomes deoxygenated. It picks up wastes from the tissues. It then enters venules. Those are the smallest, tiniest veins. Those then connect into the larger veins, which converge into the biggest veins that bring that blood back to the right atrium of the heart. So you always have that one-way flow of blood. All right, this is a diagram from your textbook which is showing the major arteries of the body. And don't freak out because we actually don't. Now, it would be perfectly reasonable to expect you to learn how to identify all of these major arteries, but look at your study guide and for clarification about which of these arteries you need to be able to identify. And as far as identification, I'm not going to use super complex, confusing diagrams that have tons and tons and tons of smaller arteries and everything looks like a big gamish, which would make it difficult, because our goal here is just for you to develop a good conceptualization for how these major arteries and veins are connected to each other and where their general locations are and how this blood flow happens throughout the body. And same thing, you want to take a look also at the major veins of the body. And again, you don't have to know the identities of all of these major veins, but the ones that you do need to know are shown on these 2 diagrams. All right, so like I said, I'm going to go ahead and introduce a little bit more about what tracing a drop of blood, that type of activity, is going to be like. Keep in mind, blood flow is a one-way street. It's due to those pressure changes that occur, the pressure drop that occurs from arteries to arterioles to capillaries to venules to veins. That keeps the blood flowing in one direction. And as I already mentioned, when you have to trace a drop of blood, like I might say trace a drop of blood to the right forearm and back to the heart, usually I'm going to ask you to start in the right atrium. So that blood drop is going to have to go through the whole pulmonary circuit, which we've learned before. We learned that back in Unit 2. The oxygenated blood comes back to the heart. It gets pumped into the ascending aorta. That's the first part of the aorta that's moving in an upward direction. Then it's going to hit the part of the aorta that arches and starts to make that curve around the back side of the heart. So we're going to take a closer look at that part of the aorta up in the aortic arch, and you're going to see that there are 3 exits off of the aortic arch. That's going to allow some blood to travel toward the head, some of the blood is going to travel toward the shoulders and the arms, and then some of it is going to pass along that curve behind the heart into the descending aorta, that part, and that's going to head down toward the abdominopelvic cavity. So we'll be taking a look at that. Then you travel through these major arteries. Eventually you reach a destination. From arteries, you're going to always enter arterioles at that body location that we're talking about. Then capillaries, where you have your exchanges that occur. Capillaries connect to venules. Venules connect to veins. Veins eventually lead to the inferior or the superior vena cava. Those are your 2 big, gigantic veins that dump into the right atrium. And just keep in mind always, this blood flow is a one-way street. If you keep that in mind, it makes things a little bit less confusing. And don't try to get too literal with these blood drop traces as we talk about them, because when I tell you to trace a drop of blood to the right forearm, we're going to use the major arteries to get there. Yes, there would be some smaller arteries that a particular blood drop would exit into in order to go to a very specific location in the forearm, like some specific part of one of your forearm muscles, for example. We're not going to learn those secondary type streets. We're just going to use the major ones, and then we're going to say arterioles and capillaries and venules at that location, and then we're going to bypass smaller veins. We're going to assume we're just using the major veins that will take that drop of blood back to the heart. So just keep those types of things in mind as we go through these types of exercises. All right, so in the next anatomy video, we are going to learn more about the major blood vessels that deliver blood to the arms and return it back to the heart. And so we'll see some of these things in a little bit more detail on the next anatomy video for Unit 3.